Hi everyone, welcome to week 2, part 2. Last week we looked at measuring out a circular warp for tablet weaving on an inkle loom. Earlier today we looked at the different kinds of looms available for tablet weaving. Both of those videos are already on the channel. We're actually going to start where we ended last week. So last week we warped up this loom. Now, I have already cut this warp because I taught this class on Facebook Live a couple minutes ago, so it's here. But this is what we ended with on that first video. We had warped up the loom was ready to go, and then. Today we're going to look at warping up straight looms, and this is any kind of loom where you start at one end and you end somewhere else. When you are finished weaving, your band is at the other end. Versus an inkle loom, you actually weave in a full circle. To start with a straight loom, you have to have already measured your warp. This is the biggest difference. When you warp up an inkle loom, you warp it up, you start weaving, you're already on the loom and ready to go. Any other kind of loom, whether that is a warp weighted loom or a board loom or an Osberg style frame loom or a box loom, all of these looms, you have to measure the warp on something, attach the warp to the loom, set it up, and then weave. That's the biggest difference. Now, if you are measuring a warp, you don't have to use anything special. You can measure a warp on fence posts. You can measure a warp on chair legs flipped upside down on a table. You can measure it on your table legs. You literally just need something you can go in a circle around because you can still measure the warp like a speed warp. If you happen to have a warping mill for warping with textiles, totally usable. The biggest things to watch out for is make sure that your warp pegs, whatever vertical surface you're using, are straight and parallel. What'll happen is if your warp pegs are like this, the warp strings that you run down here at the bottom are going to be a little longer than those you run up here at the top. That can cause you problems when you go to put it on the loom if some of your strings are then longer than the others. So if you have table legs that are, crazy shape, that's not a good choice. You want to use something that's as close to parallel as you can get. Once you've measured your warp, in this case, I'm using the warp that we measured onto this loom last weekend. All you do, you cut one end and you tie it in a little half lark knot, a little single loop right here, so it can hang out, and all that's doing is holding it in place. The cards are pinned. Now, they are not pinned because I set up the pattern. They are pinned because they're going to keep the threads in order from left to right. The more cards you have, the bigger a deal that gets. If you only have 10 cards, you might be able to warp it up without pinning them together. But overall, it's going to make your life a whole lot easier if they're already pinned. Going down to the bottom or other end of the warp, I'm going to do the exact same thing. Tie a little lark's head knot. And then I'm going to actually just reach through, and if you've done in crochet, this is that same idea. I'm just pulling the loop with my fingers, and I'm making a chain. This is a single crochet chain out of the warp. The only function this actually serves is to keep your warps neat, but it's a pretty important function. So I'm going to run all the way up to the cards, and I now have a warp. This is a tablet weaving warp. My cards look a little crazy because I picked it up sideways, but here is cards. They're actually straight and neat, mostly. All right, we have our cards. We have our, what I refer to generally as the top end next to the cards, and then our chain warp threads that are just running down there together. There's no knots, there's no anything crazy about this. We are done with our warping board. The inkle loom, in my case, again, does not have to be. At this point, you could stop. You could walk away. You have now measured out your warp. You're done. Unless you're ready to weave. The loom that I'm going to set up today is commonly called a box loom. This particular one was made by Chuck Jones of Eggles Wood Stuff. It uses, and these are kind of iconic, it has 4 pegs. Now, not all of this style loom has these extra 2 pegs up here. This just depends on what you're working with. adjust accordingly. They are not essential, but what it boils down to is you have pegs down here at the bottom that spin. So this particular one has additional fixed pegs that don't spin, a working area in between them. There is a little tab right here that you flip over to stop your dowel from spinning and moving. Now, if I am weaving and you try to tie straight onto this peg right here, and you tie your threads around it, and you spin, you notice there is no friction on my fingers. If you have tried to warp up a loom by tying directly around this peg, and then you go to advance and nothing works, this is why. You cannot anchor a warp directly on here. My particular loom has little holes drilled through, and I have apron strings. If you've looked at a textile loom, this is the same kind of setup a fabric loom will have that go through here. If your loom does not have these holes through it, you can use thumbtacks or wood glue to hold something in place. Either way, what you're creating is a fixed area. Then you use your highfalutin super fancy apron rod. Y'all, I'm a mom. I have crayons and colored pencils everywhere, so that's what I'm using. Like this. Because now what happens when I spin, it's pulling that apron rod around, and that apron rod is now sliding around that peg. This is what you're actually going to tie onto. On both ends, you need some kind of apron rod to tie your warp to. Super important, makes a world of difference. The one thing I do differently anytime I am warping on a straight loom, after I have gotten the warp measured, I've gotten it like this. I could, in theory, start down at this end and wind this onto here. However, I prefer starting up here next to my cards, because what I'm going to have to do is slide those cards all the way down the length of the warp. And as I do that, every little thread is going to get lined up and neat, and it's going to let me put them on here in the most tidy way possible, and that's going to make my life weaving a little bit easier. Now, the exception to this, if you are working with wool, the more friction you put on wool, the more wool pills, gets fuzzy, gets grabby. I would probably not do that for a wool warp. I would just be super paranoid careful when I was actually setting it up and measuring it. So for our case, I am just going to take my threads, I'm lining up all my cards here, and do not let your cards fall off the end of the threads. That sucks, has happened. Get them nice and straight, tug them down. Again, you want this as smooth as possible right in this area, but you're not necessarily needing it to be exact. You're going to take your super fancy dowel rod, and you're just going to tie your warp onto your dowel rod. Does not have to be anything fancy right here. I just use a square knot. I use a double knot because this is a silk warp and silk likes to slip away from me. Mileage may vary. You can use whatever knot you're comfortable with. So that is tied on. Now it is, if you have this additional fixed peg, make sure you go over the fixed peg down to your rotating peg. If you don't have a fixed peg, you would just go straight to your rotating and start winding it on. The other side, now I have not gone very far. The dowel rod, my super fancy dowel rod, has not even come around. So I'm about halfway turn. The one trick to this is to really make sure that these threads do not twist around each other while you're warping up. The additional safety pin right here makes this pretty easy. I know it needs to be on top, closest to the warp end. So every time that I look at my cards, if I let go and it flops around this way, I happen to know that's not right. So I can flip it back up here, and that's going to stop you from getting any twist here in these strands. You're really not going to want that. So I'm going to slide my cards down. Tug. Now I have come fully around to right here. If you just keep warping and you have several layers of thread rolling around this beam, your top layers are going to start sinking down into the individual threads in your bottom layers, and that they're not going to sink evenly. So you're going to have some threads that sink down in and pull tight, and you're going to have some threads that sit on top and are looser. And when you start weaving and you get halfway through a project and all of a sudden your tension just went crazy, it's because you had tension issues down here in the warp. Very simple fix though. These are just strips of paper. If you have calculator tape, that also works really well. I just cut up a scrap piece of paper. You're going to take that and tuck it right into that warp band. Going to keep it about straight, and then you're going to advance your warp. There now is a piece of paper between every layer of my warp. You can see the threads are in here and up here. The other thing to watch for while you're rolling this on is you want your warp to stay on top of itself. So, for example, when I am rolling here, if it starts to tug slight sideways, what's going to happen is you're going to end up with a shape down here like a football. That again is going to create some tension issues because areas where it goes left or right, the tension is not going to be as even. And again, we want tension. We want all of our threads to be the same length. So we're going to wrap around. We're keeping our line up. I'm not right now. The paper is going off to the side. As long as the paper stays under the threads, I don't care. The paper can go wherever as long as there's a single layer of it there. Do not overstress about having to get your paper squared up perfectly. But when you get to the end of the paper, just slide in. Some people will use like popsicle sticks in between layers. That'll also work. You're doing it for the exact same reason where you want to keep the threads from, let's see, actually, it's a good example. That started to twist right there. I saw that my pin was not on the bobbin, backtracked a little bit. But some people will use dowel rods or popsicle sticks or even fabric, to be honest, you could use here. All you're really trying to do is just keep the threads from sinking into themselves. So we keep on rolling. Again, we're watching our threads here because they're very happily flipping upside down from the weight of the pen. We're going to keep them on top of each other and make sure that the paper does stay in between the layers. This is also a little harder to do sideways. And we just keep on advancing. Each time I do, I am smoothing out these threads on top with my hands, making sure that this stays nice and even. Again, this is where I would probably not do this if I was working with wool. This is silk, cotton would be fine, acrylic would be fine. I would be hesitant to do it with a fabric that wanted to pill or make little shreds a whole bunch. So we're going to get to where we have just a little bit left on the other end. Okay, so we've gotten to our other end of our project. I'm going to untie it, slide our cards, making sure our band stays nice and neat. You can see here we've got a nice clean shed, even smooth lines all the way across, top and bottom. That's perfect. We're going to take our far edge, and I will flip this around because I think you guys will be able to see a little easier. And just like the top, we're going to smooth out the individual threads, get them nice and even. We're going to take our super high fancy falutin apron rod, and we are going to tie the warp around that apron rod. If you are doing a very wide band, you may want to do more than one tie because the band this knot is coming to a center place. So if I was trying to do something where the band was 3 or 4 or 5 inches wide and all of it was coming to this one center point, you could create some odd tension on these outer edges, which then have to come in. So they're going to be a little tighter than your center area. I'm working with a very narrow band. This is only 12 cards, so it's not a problem. It is something to keep in mind depending upon your actual project. Now, same exact thing. We're going to slide the tied on apron panel, or our super fancy apron rod, into the strings. Don't let it slide back out of the strings. And turn to tighten the project on to the loom. And you are now ready to weave. You're set up and good to go. So that was about a 15-minute project. Once you get that warp measured out, should be able to put it on there pretty easily. If you have questions or problems, please message me, reach out to me on Facebook or here on YouTube. I am more than happy to help. The current plan is next week to do warping up for rigid heddle or inkle weaving versus tablet weaving. And we'll probably look at the exact same two loom types, and it's a slightly different but not massively different process. So I look forward to seeing you then. Thanks.